She was 22 and reduced to nothing, sleeping on the floor of a back room in a roadside diner along Route 2 in Penobscot County, Maine, where she washed dishes for tips and slept under a coat that had once been her father's. No house, no car, no people left to call her own, just a brass ice tong handle her grandmother had pressed into her palm the year before. And $7 she had earned scraping plates and folding napkins for a long, cold week of double shifts and broken sleep. And with that $7, she bought the deed to her father's old ice house on the long south shore of Mosey Pond in Penobscot County, Maine, in a stretch of pine woods and frozen marsh that had not seen a winter ice harvest since the spring thaw of 1971. The roof had fallen in along the eastern hip and let the snow inside in slow blue drifts that had not melted since November. The pond ice was still iron blue and 7 feet deep at the cutting line, and the wind off the long water still smelled of pine resin and old sawdust, but nobody had put a saw to the pond in 53 winters, and nobody in the town of Ridgevale could rightly say what stood inside the long pine building anymore. But what nobody knew, and what nobody had known since the autumn her great-great-grandfather had finished the building with his own 2 hands, was that hidden behind the back wall of the ice house, packed deep in dry sawdust the color of old bread and sealed beneath a single pine peg, was something that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had grown up with the smell of cold, the smell of pond ice in February, and the smell of sawdust gone slightly sour after a year in the dark, and the smell of the burlap her grandmother kept stacked in the corner of the long shed, and the smell of the kerosene the old men poured into the cutting lanterns at 4 a.m. She had grown up with the slow groan of frozen water moving under a foot of clear black ice, and the way her grandmother had said, "Hush now, child. That is the pond talking, and we listen, and we do not cut a pond that is talking, and we do not put a saw into a pond that has not yet gone quiet." She had grown up with the look of a kerosene lantern set inside an empty ice house at 4 a.m, when the men of the long shore gathered with their long Norwegian ice saws and their cast iron tongs and their breath gone white in the cold lantern light, and the look of her father carrying a hooked plow across the new pond ice at sunrise, his boots steady on the iron blue surface, and the look of her grandmother standing at the wide door of the cutting shed with a pencil tucked behind her ear and the harvest ledger open against her hip, and the small, thin sound of the pencil moving across the page in the quiet of the early morning. She had grown up with the names of the cuts, the 30-pound cut for ordinary households along the Ridgevale Road, the 50-pound cut for the dairy at the bottom of the hill, the 100-pound cut, which her grandmother had called the funeral cut because it was used for the long ice boxes that kept a body cold the 3 days between dying and burying. She had grown up knowing the difference between a pond that was still freezing and a pond that was ready, and the difference between a block that would last the summer in the sawdust and a block that would not, and the difference between a winter that would hold its word and a winter that would not. She had grown up believing, the way other children believed in the things their parents believed in, that winter was not a season but a kind of inheritance, kept in a long wooden building on the south shore of a pond that did not know how to forget, kept by hands that did not know how to stop, kept in a ledger that did not know how to lie. The founder of the ice house had come to America in the autumn of 1893. His name was Anders Lars Kryer, and he had been born in Trondheim on the long western fjord of Norway in the year 1842, the son of a man who had cut winter ice for the Bergen fish trade for 40 years before him, and the grandson of a man who had cut winter ice for the same trade before that. He had come to Boston by steamship with $22 American in a leather pouch sewn into the lining of his coat. And he had carried with him a single pair of cast-iron tongs, a folded square of black oilcloth, a small wood-handled match safe, and a small copybook in which he had written, in a careful Norwegian hand, the names of every kind of pond ice he had ever cut at home, and the depth at which each had failed under the saw. He had not stayed in Boston. He had walked north and then east and then north again, looking for a pond that talked the way the ponds at home had talked. And he had found it in the second autumn of his walking, in the long pine woods of Penobscot County, on a finger of water the Penobscot people called Mosey, which meant slow, because the pond was so flat and so deep that the wind did not move its top. He had bought 23 acres on the long south shore for $41 and a promissory note signed in front of the town clerk at Ridgevale on the 14th day of October in the year 1897. He had built the ice house himself with help from two of his younger brothers and a Penobscot man named Bear Sockalexis in the long summer and the long fall of 1898, using long-cut white pine from the back lot and hand-pegged sill beams cut from the trunk of a single white oak that had fallen in the spring blow of that year. He had built the foundation on a slight rise above the south shore, where the spring snowmelt would not reach it. And he had built the long body of the building 36 feet by 22 feet, with a peaked roof of cedar shake and a single door of pine boards on heavy iron hinges set in the east wall to catch the first light of a winter morning. He had built the back wall of the ice house double thick, 2 layers of pine boards with 18 inches of dry sawdust between them. And he had said, in the careful English he had learned on the boat, that an ice house was not a building for keeping ice cold. An ice house was a building for keeping winter folded inside it through the heat of summer, and that the back wall, which faced the long north, was the most important wall in the world. He had cut his first harvest in the winter of 1898 into 1899, 1,200 blocks at 50 pounds each, and he had recorded every block in his founding ledger in his careful Norwegian hand, and at the end of the season he had set the ledger on the high shelf of the long shed, and he had said, in his careful English, "This is the first winter, and this winter will hold all the winters that come after it," and his daughter, who was 5 years old that spring, had stood beside him in the doorway of the long shed and had not said a word. The mentor of the trade was the founder's granddaughter, who was the protagonist's grandmother, and her name was Margaret Cryer, and she had been born in 1937 in a farmhouse half a mile up the Ridgevale Road from the long shore of Mosey Pond. She had begun working in the ice house at the age of 6, pulling buckets of dry pine sawdust across the long floor with both small hands wrapped around the wire handle, learning the weight of cold things, learning the slow geometry of a packed wall, learning to stand quiet in a building that did not like noise. By the time she was 8, she could read the pond, lying flat on the new ice with her ear to the surface, and she could tell from the small sounds inside the water whether the pond was still talking or had gone quiet. And she could tell from the color of the surface, the iron blue of a pond ready to cut, or the milk blue of a pond still freezing, or the slate gray of a pond hiding a spring underneath that no honest man would ever put a saw to. By the time she was 12, she could swing the long Norwegian ice saw, the one her grandfather had carried in his own hands from Trondheim, with a steady draw that did not bind in the cut, and she could read the line of a long horizontal cut without a chalk mark, and she could keep her balance on a pond that was beginning to slick at the edges. She could pack 100 blocks into a back wall in a long afternoon, and she could call the weight of a block within 2 pounds, and she could mend a cracked ice tong with a length of iron wire and a small hammer. By the time she was 15, she could grade a block of pond ice at a glance, holding it up against the morning light and reading the small lines and the small clouds inside it, the way another woman might read tea leaves, and she could tell which block was a 30, which was a 50, and which would not last the summer in the sawdust no matter how deep you packed it. She had begun to lead the morning cut on Saturdays, when the men were tired and her grandfather had begun to slow, and she had begun to call the cuts in the same calm voice her grandfather had used. By the time she was 18, she had cut 1,000 blocks of her own hand, and she had begun to keep her own ledger, in the same hand her grandfather had used, with the date of the cut, the temperature at sunrise, the depth of the pond at the cutting line, the count and weight of the blocks, and a column at the right margin for the small notes she could not bear to leave out. Like the day a heron stood on the ice for 40 minutes and did not move. Or the morning the dog of the man from the lumber camp came across the pond alone and lay down at her feet. She had taught the protagonist from the time the protagonist was 4 years old, in the long shed where the burlap was stacked, and at the cutting line on the pond in January when the protagonist's small breath made small clouds against her grandmother's coat. She had taught her the way the founder had taught his daughter, and the way the founder's daughter had taught Margit in her turn, by laying the hand on the hand and by saying nothing at all while the hand learned. There were 3 rules of the ice house, and the grandmother had taught them to the protagonist on 3 different mornings, each one in front of the back wall, each one in the long quiet of an empty building. The first rule was, you do not cut a pond that is talking. You wait, you sit on the bank, and you listen, and you do not cut until the pond has gone quiet, because a pond that is still talking is a pond that is still freezing, and ice that is still freezing will not keep, no matter how thick it gets later. Patience, the grandmother had said, patience is the first ice, and every other ice is built on top of it. There is no honest harvest that did not begin with a man or a woman sitting still on a cold bank with their hands folded in their coat, listening to a pond, and there never has been. The second rule was, you pack the back wall first. The back wall is the wall that faces the long north, and the back wall is the wall that holds the cold through July and August, and you pack it with the cleanest, hardest, oldest blocks you have, and you pack it deep, and you do not skim, and you do not cheat the corners. Anyone, the grandmother had said, can build a front wall. A front wall is for the eye of the customer who comes in the door in June and wants to see ice. A back wall is the work of a lifetime, and the back wall is the wall that decides whether the ice house keeps faith with winter through the heat of the summer. The third rule was, you write it down, every cut, every block, every weight, every reading of the sky, every man who came down to the cutting line, every dog that crossed the pond alone. The pond will forget, the grandmother had said, and the men will forget, and even you will forget, but the ledger does not forget, and the ledger is how the people who come after us will know that the winter of 1958 was hard, and that the winter of 1976 was thin, and that there was once a girl who came down to the ice house at 4 a.m. with frost on her braid. Write it down, she said. Write it all down, in your own hand, in pencil, so the snow will not blot it, and put the ledger on the high shelf of the long shed when you are done. The ledger is the last warm light of the day. The grandmother died in the spring of the protagonist's 20th year, on a morning in late March when the pond ice was beginning to slick at the edges and pull away from the shore. She had been sick through the winter, the slow sickness of an old woman who has worked outdoors for 70 years, and she had asked the protagonist on the last evening to finish the last column of the year's ledger, and the protagonist had finished it, in the same hand her grandmother had used, kneeling beside the bed with the ledger on her knees and the kerosene lantern on the table. And she had not cried, because she had not yet known how. She had set the pencil down on the open page. She had closed the ledger. She had put her hand on her grandmother's hand, and her grandmother had said, "The back wall, child, the back wall." And then she had not said anything else, and the small thin breath had gone out of her in the long quiet of the small bedroom. The father had not been a man for the ice house. He had loved his mother, and he had loved the pond, but his hands had been for other work. The work of a long-haul driver out of Bangor, and the ice house had stood empty after the grandmother died, with the roof beginning to go along the eastern hip and the back wall still standing, and the ledger still closed on the kitchen table of the farmhouse half a mile up the road. The father had died in the second autumn after the grandmother. A truck on a wet road outside of Millinocket on a Tuesday in late October. In the same week the first frost came down over the long shore. The protagonist had been 21. There had been a small funeral at the Lutheran church in Ridgevale, and a foreclosure on the farmhouse 2 months later, and a notice from the bank pinned to the door, and a final box of things left on the bench of a cousin's back porch in a cold November rain. And then there had been nothing, and the protagonist had walked the 4 long miles back into Ridgevale with the brass tong handle in her coat pocket and a folded photograph of her grandmother in her shirt pocket and $7 in her hand. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a quiet place in your family where something old was kept alive in the dark, that you carry with you now from someone who is no longer here? The notice in the window of the Ridgevale Town Hall had said the deed to the ice house property on Mosey Pond was up for back taxes, and the figure beside it had been $7.40, and the clerk inside, a small man in a green wool sweater named Mr. Hollis Wickham, had been the same clerk who had once played a fiddle at her grandmother's 75th birthday. He had looked up when she said her grandmother's name, and then he had looked at her a second time, and he had gone still in the way that older people in small towns go still when a name carries more weight than the speaker yet knows. "Crier," he said, "that key has been in the back drawer of this office since the spring your grandmother passed. We held it because we hoped somebody would come for it." He came back from the storeroom with a long iron key on a square of brown paper. He set it on the counter between them, and he took her $7, and he wrote her a paper receipt in a careful blue ink. "The place has been waiting for you, child," he said, "and you took your time. But you came." Then he laid his hand on the back of hers for one short second, and he let her go. She walked the 4 miles out of Ridgevale along the long county road that afternoon, with the iron key in her right coat pocket and the brass tong handle in her left coat pocket, and a light snow beginning to come down over the woods in slow, deliberate flakes, the kind of snow her grandmother had said meant the pond would be quiet by morning. The road bent east along the bottom of the long hill, past the old lumber mill that had been closed since the 70s and the small white Lutheran church where her father's funeral had been held, and then it bent north along the line of the old logging path, and then it opened, the way the road had always opened, into the long south shore of Mosey Pond, where the trees stepped back and the pond stretched on for 3/4 of a mile under a sky the color of pewter and old tin and the slow last light of a February afternoon. The ice house stood, where it had always stood, on a slight rise above the south shore, its long pine boards gone silver and gray with the slow work of 50 Maine winters, its roof fallen in along the eastern hip the way Mr. Wickham had said it would be, its single door still set on its heavy iron hinges, and a small drift of snow piled against the threshold the way the snow had always piled when nobody had come down the long road to brush it away. She walked up the slope. She brushed the snow from the threshold with the side of her boot. She set her hand against the door. The door had been built by her great-great-grandfather Anders Lars Crier in the long fall of 1898. And the door had been rehung by her grandfather in the spring of 1962, and the door had not been opened in the 4 winters since her grandmother had last walked out of it in the spring of her dying. She put the iron key into the iron lock. She turned the key once to the right. The bolt drew back with the quiet, certain click of a thing, remembering what it was for. She pushed the door inward. The hinges made the long, slow sound that iron makes when it has been waiting. She stepped inside. The inside of the ice house smelled of cold and of old sawdust and of pine and of a 50-year silence, and the light came down through the broken roof in pale ribbons, lying across the long floor in soft pale rectangles, and her own breath made small clouds in front of her. And the back wall, the wall her great-great-grandfather had built double thick with 18 inches of dry sawdust between 2 layers of pine, the wall her grandmother had called the most important wall in the world. The wall her grandmother had whispered about with her last breath, stood directly across from the door, gray and patient and unmoved by the long passage of the years, and it was waiting for her. She crossed the long room in 11 slow steps, the floorboards giving under her boots the small, dry complaint of pine that has carried a great deal of weight across a great deal of time. She set the brass tong handle on a sawdust ledge that had once held the cutting saws. She put her hand against the back wall. The pine boards were dry and cold and slightly warmer at the bottom, where the sawdust still held the last winter's chill. And she felt along the seam where the back wall met the floor, slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her to feel along the line of a fresh cut for a hidden flaw, and her fingers caught on a small irregularity, a wooden peg that did not sit flush with the others, the way a single dark thread does not sit flush in the weave of a clean cloth. She bent down. She set both hands against the peg. She drew it out, slow. There was a small click somewhere inside the wall, and then a soft give, and then a section of the back wall, 3 boards wide and 4 feet high, swung inward on a hidden iron hinge, the way the door of a cupboard might swing, and a wave of older, drier cold rolled out of the opening, the kind of cold that has been folded carefully inside a building for 126 winters. She knelt down in front of the opening. She felt for the kerosene lantern her grandmother had kept on the high shelf. The lantern with the brass collar and the wick still trimmed from the last cutting season of 1971. And she drew it down, and she struck a long match against the iron of the door, and she lit the wick. The lantern came up in a slow, warm circle of amber light, and the lantern light went into the opening in the back wall, and the back wall gave up its secret at last. Inside the hidden cavity, packed deep in dry pine sawdust the color of old bread, there were 3 things, set with the deliberate care of a man who had known that the 3 things would not be found in his lifetime. There was a long cedar chest, the size of a small coffin, with iron hasps and a leather strap gone dry with the years. There was a tin cylinder, the size of a stovepipe, set upright in the sawdust, and there was a small parcel wrapped in black oilcloth and tied with a length of red wool string, set on top of the chest as if it had been placed there last and left for the last finder. She drew the parcel out first. The oilcloth was the same black oilcloth her great-great-grandfather had carried from Norway, and she could feel the careful folds his hands had made in 1898. She set it on the floor and untied the wool string. Inside the oilcloth was a leather-bound book, hand-stitched, with the words written on the cover in a careful Norwegian hand, Isenbog, which her grandmother had taught her meant ice book, and underneath, in English, the founding ledger of the Cryer Ice House on Mosey Pond, Penobscot County, Maine, begun in the winter of 1898, in the hand of A.L. Cryer, late of Trondheim. She drew the tin cylinder out next. She pried the lid free. Inside the cylinder, rolled tight and standing upright, were the cutting tools her great-great-grandfather had carried across the Atlantic, the long Norwegian ice saw with its hand-shaped birch handle, the pair of cast-iron tongs whose matching brass handle was in her coat pocket at that moment, the founder's hooked ice plow with the date 1873 stamped into the iron, and the long-cut pine measuring rod in a single piece, marked in the older feet of the older country. She drew the cedar chest out last. The leather strap had gone dry and stiff, and she unbuckled it with care. She lifted the iron hasps. She opened the lid of the chest. The chest was lined with linen the color of cream, and on the linen, in 11 careful rows, lay 144 gold coins, struck in the United States Mint of Philadelphia in the years between 1862 and 1898, each one wrapped in a separate square of waxed paper, in the careful Norwegian hand of a man who had counted them one by one in the long autumn of his 66th year. And on top of the coins, sealed with a red wax seal in the shape of a small fish, lay a letter, addressed in the founder's careful hand to whoever finds this. She set the lantern down. She broke the seal. She unfolded the letter. The paper was thick, and the ink had held its black through 126 winters. She read the letter aloud in the cold lantern light, and the back wall of the ice house heard the founder's voice for the first time in the long memory of the building. To whoever finds this, the letter began. I am Anders Lars Kryer, late of Trondheim, in the Kingdom of Norway, and presently of the long south shore of Mosey Pond in Penobscot County, in the state of Maine. I am writing this letter in the autumn of the year 1898, on the day I finished the back wall of this ice house, and I am putting this letter, along with the savings of my life and the tools of my trade and the founding ledger of this house, into the wall I have built. Because a back wall is the wall of a lifetime, and a back wall is the wall where a man can leave the things that matter for the people who come after him. I have built this ice house because the pond at the bottom of my new country talks the way the ponds at home talked, and because winter is a thing that must be folded carefully into a building if it is to last through the heat of summer, and because the people who live along this shore need ice for their dairies and their kitchens and their dead. I have built the back wall double thick because I have known winters that were not honest, and I have known summers that were not kind. If you are reading this letter, then I am long gone, and the ones who came between me and you are also gone. I do not know who you are. I hope you are one of my own. I hope your hands remember the tongs. I hope the pond has spoken to you, and you have listened. The coins in the chest were earned at this trade, between the year of my landing and the year of the writing of this letter. They are for the one who finds the wall. Spend them as if they were the patience of an old man and not the money of a young one. Be good to the back wall. Anders Lars Kryer, Ice Master, Mosey Pond. The 11th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1898. She did not cry. She set the letter down on the linen of the chest, and she set her palm flat against the back of the chest, and she let the cold lantern light hold her for a long moment, and then she gathered the letter and the ledger and the tools and the chest, and she carried them in 3 slow trips into the long shed. And she set them on the bench beneath the high window, where the snow light came in pale and clean. A coin appraiser named Mr. Edmund Casey came up from the city of Bangor in the 2nd week of March. He spent 2 days with the coins on a small green felt cloth at the back of the long shed, and he weighed each one, and he held each one up against the lamp, and he wrote small notes in a small book in a small careful hand. And at the end of the 2nd day he set down his loop, and he wrote a figure on a piece of paper, and he handed it to the protagonist across the bench. The figure was $38,400. She read the figure. She folded the paper. She put it inside the founding ledger between the page for the winter of 1898 and the page for the winter of 1899. "Thank you, Mr. Casey," she said. She walked him to the door of the long shed, and she stood and watched him go down the longshore road in the slow March light. She did not spend the money quickly. She paid the back taxes on the property for the next 10 years in a single morning at the town hall, and Mr. Wickham wrote out each receipt without saying a word. She had the roof of the ice house mended along the eastern hip by an old roofer out of Ridgevale who had known her grandmother, and who would not take payment for the labor. She had the long shed reshingled. She had the door of the ice house rehung on new iron hinges hammered by a smith at the head of the pond. She bought a new wick for the kerosene lantern and a fresh supply of dry pine sawdust from the lumber camp at the head of the pond, and a new ledger book, hand-stitched, into which she would begin to write the cuts of the year, in the same careful hand her great-great-grandfather had used. The first to come up the longshore road in the slow spring thaw was a woman named Mrs. Della Tibbets, who had been the schoolteacher of the protagonist's grandmother, and who was now 91 years old, and who came carrying a small jar of strawberry preserves from her own garden and a memory of the protagonist's grandmother at 6 years old, standing on the back step of the long shed with a bucket of sawdust nearly as tall as she was. "Your grandmother could read a pond before she could read a book," Mrs. Tibbet said, and she set the jar on the bench beside the founding ledger. And she did not stay long. The second to come, 2 weeks later, was a man named Mr. Gabriel Sockalexis, the great-grandson of the Bear Sockalexis, who had helped Anders Lars Cryer raise the back wall in the long fall of 1898, and he came carrying a small carved wooden fish on a length of red wool string. "My great-grandfather kept that string for your great-great-grandfather's seal," he said, in the careful, low voice of a man who had been waiting many years to deliver a small thing, "and I have been keeping it since my own father passed for the next crier who would come down the longshore road." She set both gifts on the high shelf of the long shed, beside the kerosene lantern and the founding ledger. That's the thing about the ice trade our grandmothers teach us, and that the founders of our houses leave for us in the back walls of their buildings. It is not really about the ice, and it is not really about the pond, and it is not really about the cold. It is about patience, which is the first ice, and every other ice is built on top of it. It is about the back wall, which is the work of a lifetime, and which holds the cold through every summer that is yet to come, and which is built once and built carefully and built for the strangers who will come after. It is about the ledger, which does not forget, and which is the way the ones who come after us will know that we were here, and that we listened to the pond, and that we kept the faith with winter through the heat of the summer. Patience, the back wall, the ledger. That is all there is. That is the whole trade. That is what a grandmother teaches a granddaughter at the door of the long shed at 4 o'clock in the morning. That is what a founder leaves folded inside a wall for a child he will never meet. That is the last warm light of the day. Her name was Elsa Margit Cryer. She was 22 years old. She had been homeless and reduced to nothing in a roadside diner along Route 2 in Penobscot County, Maine. She had $7 to her name, and she spent it on her father's old ice house on the long south shore of Mosey Pond. It was the best $7 she ever spent. If this story warmed you tonight, leave a small word in the comments and we will read it. See you in the last warm light of the day.